Now that we are officially in the holiday season and the holiday mode, it is currently raining as we're recording right now. I thought that it would be fitting for us to go through a series in terms of the holidays. Obviously, we have Thanksgiving coming up soon, and then Christmas and Advent coming up as well. And I thought, well, I think one of the traditions that I kind of grew up um, with as it relates to the holidays, that wasn't just presents and all that stuff, was food. Eating a lot of good food around the table, right, with family and friends and so on and so forth. And I believe that that's kind of a tradition that maybe not all, but many of us have as well for the holidays. And I thought, well, why don't we look through the Bible and see how food and meals and coming together around a table impact the stories of the holidays, or in this instance, Thanksgiving or Christmas as well. So that's what we're going to do for these next several weeks in the holiday season. We're going to be looking at meals all throughout the Bible. We come to the story of Christmas, or almost Christmas, where eating and drinking um, happen a lot throughout Scripture. So that, well, I guess, as we culminate, we would find the true taste of Christmas. That is joy, belonging, purpose, and hope. So first, I think a question that I asked myself as I was kind of formulating this kind of idea, was that why is sharing a meal important? That's something I want us to think about too, in terms of sharing meals, right? We don't just share meals with anyone, do we? Right? It's a very kind of selective thing, I believe, that we all do when we choose to share meals with people. Okay, so my initial question is, why is sharing a meal important? Well, in the Bible, eating with someone wasn't necessarily about just sharing food. It's obviously a good part of it because everyone likes good food. But in the Bible, eating with someone was also about sharing fellowship, peace, and relationship. Okay? Now, in ancient Near Eastern culture, eating together also symbolized friendship, trust, and reconciliation. Okay, so if we go back to the time of the Bible, things like friendship, trust, and reconciliation were very symbolic in terms of eating together. That when you sat down to eat with someone, it literally meant that you're at peace with them. Okay, no hostility, no barriers, no walls. Okay, we were at peace with one another. To share a meal, coincidentally, was to basically say, um, we belong with each other. Okay, uh, we accept each other. I accept you, you accept me. Okay, that was the understanding in the ancient Near Eastern culture, and that's why when Jesus, for example, ate with tax collectors and sinners, right? If you remember that, the religious leaders got all upset. They all got up in arms and mad because they saw Jesus eating with these people, and they thought Jesus was approving of those people, like approving of what they did, whereas Jesus, more or less, was just showing God's open invitation to any and all. Okay? It had nothing to do with approving what they did. It was basically giving them an opportunity to come to the table to meet God, right? And let God do the work to change. Meals also often sealed covenants that in both the Old and New Testaments, meals and food were used to confirm relationships or covenants. For example, in the book of Exodus, after the covenant was made at Mount Sinai, Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel ate and drank before the Lord. Okay? In the book of Genesis, when Isaac made peace with Abimelech, they ate a meal together to seal their covenant bond. So eating together was a kind of a sacred act in a lot of ways, a visible sign of an invisible bond. Okay. Now, meals also expressed hospitality, which was a major virtue. I believe it's a gift, right? Whereas hospitality was a huge part in biblical faith. Inviting someone to eat at your table was a way to show, again, kindness, generosity, and love. Okay? Another example from Genesis was that Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, welcomed 3 visitors and prepared a meal for them. Okay, the widow, in First King, there's a story of a widow who shared her last bit of food with the prophet Elijah. Okay, so again, hospitality wasn't necessarily just about being polite, right, and offering food whenever you come in. It was actually more, if you could look at it as kind of a duty or like a spiritual duty, reflecting God's own hospitality toward his people. So you didn't necessarily do it just to be like nice or like show favor, but actually it was kind of a duty, right? This is what we do, right? As God has shown us hospitality, therefore we show others hospitality with food. Okay, so if you look at it that way, it kind of changes, I think, our perspective about this idea of hospitality as well. Now, meals also foreshadow God's kingdom. Jesus, for example, used meals to reveal what the kingdom of God was like. He would use terms like he compared the kingdom of God to a great banquet where literally everyone was invited. Or, we take communion once a month, or the Lord's Supper, and it was instituted at a meal, okay, symbolizing our fellowship with Christ and one another. Okay, they all go hand in hand. Okay, that's why they call it the Lord's Supper kind of idea, or that's what one of the ways that we call communion is the Lord's Supper. Also, at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, the final picture of redemption is that of a feast. Okay, feast, the marriage supper of the Lamb. Okay, so again, all these ideas have to do with sharing fellowship and communion through a meal at a table with good food. Now, finally, eating together also created this idea of community. Okay, in the early church, in the book of Acts. Now, the book of Acts is kind of the sequel to the Gospels, or the sequel more specifically to the Gospel of Luke, as they were one long manuscript. So again, the book of Acts came after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension to heaven, where the early church was trying to figure out what do we do now with this idea of following in the legacy of our teacher and dear beloved Rabbi Jesus. Okay, one of the things they did in Acts 2 that the believers, or about the believers, is that they broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. Okay, again, meals weren't just necessarily for nourishment, right, and just to fill your stomach and be done with it. They more or less built like a spiritual family. The table was where faith became personal and also relational. I'm sure that we all could think of examples of how sharing a meal together grew relationships, right? It grew a family, right? Became really, really personal, right? And it was obviously done through a meal. So I want us to kind of think about who we share meals with. Why is it so significant that we share meals with these specific people and these specific people only, right? And then we can kind of get into who do we want to share a meal with too, right? Because again, it's a really, really kind of sacred kind of thing that we do with one another. So again, I want us to kind of think about and tease that out in our minds of this idea of food and belonging, right, as it relates to sharing meals together. So as we wrap this idea up, eating together in the Bible meant much more, again, than merely just sharing food, right? It meant sharing life. It symbolized peace, covenant, belonging, forgiveness, and love. Okay? Jesus' mission was to seek and save the lost, and his method was often through, a lot of times, a meal. Okay? Through the power of hospitality and grace, we also can join him in passing this idea of peace to others. So again, this idea of who do we want to share a meal with, right? Kind of idea. What would kind of get us out of our own comfort zones in order to do that? Okay, so now, again, in these next several weeks, we're going to take a look at instances in the Bible where people eat and invite and share and show grace. Because again, what a time to do it, right? Sounds like a fitting time, right? So 'tis the season, folks. So our first story um, from the Bible takes place, that we're going to take a closer look at, is in the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel 9. So 2 Samuel 9. Okay, we're going to start at 1 through 3, and then we're going to kind of continue on through this chapter. Okay, so again, 2 Samuel 9, starting on 1 through 3, it says this. King David asked, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and he was summoned to David. The king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." The king said, "Is there anyone remaining of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." Okay, to kind of set the stage a little bit, in 2 Samuel 9, we find one of the I believe, the most beautiful pictures of God's grace in the Old Testament. Okay, King David, now established on a throne, on his throne, right? He succeeded King Saul. Very interesting relationship, right? That goes through the prophetic books of the Samuels, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Okay, so King David succeeded Saul, now established on a throne, kind of remembers a promise he made years earlier, a promise to show kindness, okay, to the family of his dear friend Jonathan. Okay, and him and Jonathan, they were besties. They were bros, and they were best friends. Okay, they were besties. Okay, so David begins with the question, not who deserves my favor as the king, lording my power over people, but who can I show kindness to? Okay, now the word kindness in the original language was a word hesed. Does that ring any bells, right? Hesed was the word used various times in the book of Ruth, the story we just studied, right? If you remember her, right? The young immigrant young woman who, well, let's just say, did it about face and was in the lineage of King David himself. Okay, so the word kindness, or hesed, means, again, a covenant loyalty or a steadfast love, an everlasting love, the kind of love God shows to his people. David wasn't looking for repayment or gain. He was looking to extend grace, okay, because of a promise made in love. Okay, this is exactly what God does with us. He searches for those to show his grace to. Not because of what we've done, because we've done literally nothing to earn that. It's merely because of who he is. That is what God does. Okay, that is the character of God. Okay, now in the story, King David's kindness reaches a man who never expected to be called. Well, and it was a man named Mephibosheth. Right, just try saying that 3 or 4 times, right? And Mephibosheth was from a place called Lo-Debar. And Lo-Debar in the Bible, and this is where it's kind of funny, these ancient writers were also kind of funny, because Lo-Debar, this ancient city, literally means no pasture, no word, or literally nowhere. Okay? It's a barren and forgotten place, literally, fitting for a man who had lost everything, quite literally. He was a son of his best friend, Jonathan. Okay? And as we learn from the scriptures about Mephibosheth, was that he was crippled in his feet. So he couldn't really walk. Being basically physically broken, socially outcast, because remember, if you had any kind of disability back in this time of the Bible, that meant, well, you or your ancestors must have done something to upset God. Okay? And this is your punishment. You are living out the punishment of either what you did or your ancestors did as well. So again, not only that you are physically disabled, but that you are also reminded of that every day in this time and space, as you are literally outcast from normal society. Lo-Debar, right? He's basically living in nowhere. Okay? So also, Mephibosheth had every reason to fear David, right? Fear for his life, I mean, too. Because in ancient times, new kings often, to put it nicely, eliminated, right, the family of the previous dynasty to secure their throne. Okay, so basically they didn't need remnants of the other dynasty, or the previous monarchy, I guess you could say, alive, right? Because they didn't need any threats to their kingdom, right? So when David's messengers arrived, Mephibosheth must have expected death. I'd imagine that he was basically that was his fate, right? That he was dead, right? But instead, what he found was grace. Instead, 2 Samuel 9:7, skipping down a few verses, says this. David said to Mephibosheth, do not be afraid, for I will show kindness, or hesed, okay, for the sake of your father Jonathan. Remember, they're besties. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always. Okay, so again, his bestie Jonathan, he was the son of Saul, former nemesis, former king. Okay, him and David, Saul and David had a really contentious relationship. Okay, David showed a lot of grace because that's who he is. But ironically, his best friend was, well, King Saul's son Jonathan. Okay, so he is showing grace to Jonathan, who had passed away, his son Mephibosheth. Okay, so in the scripture right before this, when Mephibosheth was brought before David, he literally fell on his face, right? A crippled man bowing before a mighty king. But David said two basically life-changing words that probably he did not expect to hear, right? Do not fear, right? Do not fear. David had every right to judge him and, well, to not keep him alive, right? I mean, he was well within his right to do so. I mean, nobody would have blinked if he followed through and eliminated these people, okay? But instead, he had offered him restoration. I will restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather, right? Talk about grace upon grace. And then the unthinkable, you shall eat at my table always, okay? To which Mephibosheth responds, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog such as I? Okay. Now, we have to keep in mind, dogs back in this time and space, and in biblical times, weren't like the cuddly, cute things that we keep here as pets or companions or service dogs or whatnot. Right? They were, let's just put it nicely, they were nuisances back in this time. Right? They were dirty and despicable and just no, like you didn't associate with dogs back in this time. But he didn't just refer to himself as a dog. He referred to himself as a dead dog. That's humility, my folks. That's humility. And it's also the human heart recognizing its unworthiness before a gracious king. Okay, so it might be a little hard, but if we try to put ourselves in Mephibosheth's shoes, it doesn't have a lot going for him, right? Because he is crippled in both of his feet, so I think that's a huge strike against him because he's literally now an outcast. He's living in a place called nowhere. He is basically on borrowed time at this point because his grandfather Saul, well, yeah, let's just say he made a few mistakes in his life, and therefore when King David took over, he kind of knew that it was coming, right? He knew that his life was literally more so on borrowed time. But to hear David offer him restoration, land, and to eat at my table, that's probably something that wasn't in his bingo card, right? As to what would happen, right? And so on and so forth. Or to put it quite simply, this is the gospel, friends. This is gospel found in the Old Testament, right? Where Mephibosheth, spiritually crippled, broken by sin, hiding in Lodabar kind of thing, hiding in nowhere, right? If we could relate to that to us too, well, have we ever been broken by sin or hiding in our own, wherewithal, unworthy to stand before the king? But because of Jesus, God calls us by name and says, do not fear. Therefore, you shall eat at my table always. Okay, what a wonderful, wonderful act of grace. Continuing on in verse 9, then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food to eat, but your master's grandson Mephibosheth shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Not only did David keep Mephibosheth alive, he offered him a place at the table to eat, and also to have Ziba and his people, more people whom David probably should have killed, to be completely honest, okay? Because Ziba, he was loyal to Saul, right? And Saul, well, he didn't do very nice things to David, let's just put it that way, right? That's putting it quite nicely. But he gave him land. He gave them land to till, and you can have the land, but just make sure you feed the master's grandson, Mephibosheth, right? Stay alive, you and your, 15 sons and 20 servants, have at it, kind of thing. Kept them all alive, right? Again, what a wonderful, wonderful act of grace in the midst of chaos and violence, monarchy and war. Okay? And then finally, in 2 Samuel 9:11, Mephibosheth ate at David's table, like one of the king's sons. Left for dead, crippled in the feet, an outcast, living in nowhere, to now, you're eating at the king's table, like one of the king's sons. How about that, right? Isn't that cool? What a beautiful sentence, right? The man, again, who thought he was going to die is now eating like a son, okay? Every day, Mephibosheth sat at that royal table, his broken feet hidden beneath the king's tablecloth, his shame literally covered by the king's invitation. The table became a place for Mephibosheth of belonging, restoration, and identity. Okay, this wasn't just a guest. Okay, this wasn't just just last resort, invite this guy to come, kind of thing. He was literally adopted into the family of the king. That is what God does, my friends. This is what God does. This is what God does back in the Old Testament and through Christ as well. Okay? He restores what was lost. He gives us a place of honor. He seats each and every one of us at the table, not as servants or forgotten ones, but as sons and daughters. Praise be to God for that. Thanks be to him. That when we come to the Lord's table, we're reminded of this same truth. Again, once crippled by sin, we now dine with the King through grace alone. So this idea from Mephibosheth, from low to bar, right? From nowhere, futility, basically, to the table of the king. Okay? The story about this man who was invited to the king's table because, again, of someone else's merit. It was Jonathan, right? Because him and David were besties, right? This is a picture of grace. We sit at God's table not because we earned it, right? None of us have earned it, right? So let's put that away, put that idea away. We haven't earned anything, right? It's merely because of what God does. Okay, this is what God does. Okay, and this is a beautiful picture of that. That grace isn't about being good enough, it's about being invited and also coincidentally accepting the invitation of grace. Okay. As we close, I offer food. Maybe not in a physical sense, but I offer us to ponder the question of food, right? Who would we want to invite to the table, right? To show grace to? Who is deserving of it, right? I hope that we would be convicted today of the idea that according to the story and as to what God does, each and every one of us is invited to that table, right? If we've ever felt like we had a low to bar moment, or we hit rock bottom kind of thing, there's a table waiting for us. Why? Because we are all sons and daughters of the King. I pray we could take this idea and roll with it as we get into this holiday season, where we will do a lot of that, hopefully. A lot of good food, a lot of good family, a lot of good friends. I pray that we would see God through each and every one of those encounters and challenge us and push us to maybe step out of our boundaries in terms of who to invite to the table. Because, well, people, I believe that people want to be at the table, to be filled with the idea of being a part of something and being accepted as well. So I pray that the Lord will bring those to mind who need a sense of grace. I pray that we would also be convicted of the idea that we are all also, lastly, sons and daughters of the King. May we go from here and be able to live that out and share that with others.